On the 13th day of August in the year 1945, with the sun climbing toward its zenith over the Korean peninsula, a solitary American fighter aircraft carved through the humid air above Keijo, the ancient capital now known to the world as Seoul. The pilot gripping the controls of that aircraft, a Thunderbolt painted olive drab and bearing the serial number 44-88211, carried a burden heavier than the 8 tons of steel and firepower surrounding him. He carried the weight of every sortie flown without a kill, every engagement concluded without confirmation, every return to base shadowed by the gnawing awareness that, while other men became aces, he remained ordinary. What First Lieutenant Oscar Francis Perdomo could not have known, as he scanned the sky for enemy aircraft on that sultry afternoon, was that he was about to compress an entire war's worth of aerial combat into a span of minutes so compressed, so violent, and so utterly decisive that his name would be etched into history as the last man to achieve ace status in a single day during the Second World War. And he could not have known that the war itself, the vast machinery of death and destruction that had consumed the world for 6 years, was already dying, its final heartbeats measured not in days but in hours, though the men in the sky that afternoon fought as though eternity stretched before them. The Pacific Theater in August of 1945 existed in a state of surreal tension, a war simultaneously concluded and continuing, dead yet still capable of killing. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima on the 6th of August had vaporized a city and introduced humanity to a new era of warfare. 3 days later, Nagasaki had suffered the same fate. In Tokyo, the Japanese High Command convened in desperate, bitter conferences, debating surrender while military hardliners advocated for a final, suicidal defense of the home islands. Emperor Hirohito prepared to address his nation for the first time in recorded history, to speak words of capitulation that would shatter the myth of divine invincibility. But in the space between the dropping of the bombs and the acceptance of defeat, combat operations continued. Aircraft still flew. Guns still fired. Men still died. The pilots of both sides, ignorant of the deliberations occurring in government chambers and imperial palaces, climbed into their cockpits and pursued their missions with the same deadly seriousness they had maintained for years. They did not know they were fighting the last battles of the last day of the last great war of the 20th century. They knew only the sky, the enemy, and the mission. Oscar Perdomo understood machines. Born in Mexico and raised in Southern California, he had come to aviation through the familiar American route of mechanical aptitude and wartime necessity. The Army Air Forces took young men with quick hands and steady nerves, taught them to fly, taught them to fight, and sent them across oceans to do both. Perdomo had flown combat missions for months, accumulating hours in the cockpit of the P-47 Thunderbolt, a fighter that veterans described with a mixture of affection and respect. The Thunderbolt was not graceful. It was not nimble. It did not dance through the air like the Mustang or climb like the Spitfire. It was a thundering, brutish machine built around a single principle: overwhelming power applied with absolute reliability. Its Pratt & Whitney R2-800 engine generated over 2,400 horsepower, driving a propeller 13 feet in diameter. Its fuselage, thick and heavily armored, could absorb punishment that would have shredded lighter aircraft. Its .850 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing, could deliver a weight of fire that turned enemy aircraft into expanding clouds of debris in seconds. Pilots who flew the Thunderbolt learned to trust it, to rely on its strength when skill alone proved insufficient. They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and they meant it as a compliment. The P-47N variant that Perdomo flew represented the final evolution of the Thunderbolt lineage. Designed specifically for the vast distances of the Pacific, It carried additional fuel capacity in its wings, extending its range to over 2,000 miles. This was crucial in a theater where enemy targets lay across hundreds of miles of open ocean, where a mechanical failure or navigation error meant death by drowning long before rescue could arrive. The N model featured a slightly longer fuselage, squared wingtips, and a taller vertical stabilizer, modifications that improved high-speed handling but added weight. A fully loaded P-47N weighed over 10 tons, making it one of the heaviest single-engine fighters ever built. Pilots had to manage this mass carefully, calculating fuel consumption against distance, altitude against speed, always aware that the ocean below offered no second chances. The mathematics of survival became second nature. Fuel burns at this rate, target is this far, return requires this much reserve. Every calculation mattered. Every error could be fatal. Perdomo had painted nose art on his aircraft, a common practice that transformed military equipment into something personal, something human. He named his Thunderbolt Lil May's Meat Chopper, a phrase combining affection with grim humor. The name referenced his infant son, Kenneth, known in the family as Lil May, a child who would grow up hearing stories of his father's war but would never truly understand the weight those stories carried, until he himself went to war decades later in the jungles of Vietnam, never to return. The meat chopper designation referred to the Thunderbolt's primary function, the destruction of enemy aircraft and ground targets with its 8 machine guns, weapons that could collectively fire 400 rounds per second, a mechanical butcher delivering death at 300 miles per hour. The nose art was Perdomo's way of carrying home with him into combat, of maintaining a connection to the life that existed beyond the killing, beyond the endless cycle of missions and debriefings and maintenance and waiting. But it also served as a reminder of what he had not yet accomplished. Unlike many pilots in his unit, unlike the men whose aircraft bore multiple small Japanese flags beneath the canopy rail, each flag representing a confirmed aerial victory, Perdomo had no kills. He was an experienced combat pilot without the defining achievement that separated fighter pilots from mere flyers. He wanted to become an ace. The path to ace status required 5 confirmed aerial victories. It was an arbitrary number, a threshold established more by tradition than tactical significance, but it carried enormous weight in fighter pilot culture. Aces were the elite, the proven, the men whose skill and luck had combined to produce a statistical improbability. Most fighter pilots never shot down a single enemy aircraft. They flew their missions, dropped their bombs, strafed ground targets, and returned home having contributed to the war effort without ever engaging in the one-on-one aerial duels that captured public imagination. Those who did manage to destroy enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat often achieved 1 or 2 victories over an entire combat tour. Becoming an ace required not just skill, but opportunity, timing, and circumstances that aligned rarely and briefly. Perdomo had flown dozens of missions without achieving a single confirmed kill. He had seen enemy aircraft, engaged them when possible, fired his guns in anger, but confirmation required witnesses or gun camera footage showing the destruction of the target, and such evidence had always eluded him. Every mission became another opportunity, another chance to prove himself, another failure when he returned with ammunition expended and no kills to show for it. The frustration built with each flight, a quiet accumulation of disappointed hopes. On the morning of August 13th, Perdomo prepared for what would be another armed reconnaissance mission over Korea. Intelligence reports indicated continued Japanese air activity, despite the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, despite the clear indications that Japan's military capacity had been shattered beyond recovery. The Japanese military, or at least significant portions of it, remained defiant, determined to resist to the last man if the government chose to continue the war. American planners, uncertain whether Japan would surrender or force an invasion of the home islands, maintained combat operations across the entire Pacific theater. Pilots received their briefings, checked their aircraft, and launched into missions identical to those they had flown for months. Nothing about the morning of August 13th suggested that this day would be different from any other, that history was about to compress years of war into hours, hours into minutes, minutes into seconds of irreversible decision. Perdomo took off from his base in Okinawa, an island seized at horrific cost just months earlier, now converted into a massive staging area for air operations against Japan and its remaining territories. The flight to Korea covered hundreds of miles of open ocean, a journey requiring careful attention to navigation and fuel management. The Thunderbolt's engine consumed fuel steadily, its massive appetite necessitating constant mental calculation. Pilots developed an instinct for fuel state, a awareness that manifested as a subtle background anxiety, always present, never quite forgotten. The Pacific had swallowed thousands of aircraft and their crews, men who ran out of fuel just miles short of safety, men who ditched into the ocean and were never seen again, men whose last moments were spent watching their altitude decrease while the sea rose to meet them. Perdomo flew with this knowledge, as did every pilot in the theater. It shaped every decision, every maneuver, every calculation of risk versus reward. As Perdomo approached Korean airspace, flying at altitude with his engine throttled back for maximum fuel efficiency, he maintained vigilance. Enemy aircraft could appear at any time, emerging from cloud cover or climbing from below. The sky seemed empty until suddenly it was not, until the empty blue was suddenly filled with hostile aircraft whose pilots wanted nothing more than to kill you before you could kill them. Fighter combat in 1945 remained largely visual. Radar existed but was primitive by later standards, useful primarily for ground-based interception. Once airborne, pilots relied on their eyes, scanning the sky in sectors, checking above and behind, always behind, because the worst attacks came from the enemy you never saw. The strain of constant vigilance wore on men's minds and bodies. Hours of boredom punctuated by seconds of terror, the cliché went, but the reality was worse. Hours of vigilant tension followed by seconds of terror, so intense that memory could barely contain it. Perdomo saw them. Below him, a formation of Japanese aircraft moved through the sky, heading west. He counted them, approximately 15 aircraft, likely a mixed formation. The distance made identification difficult, but their configuration and flight characteristics suggested fighters and trainers, a combination that indicated the Japanese were using whatever aircraft remained operational to maintain some semblance of combat capability. By August 1945, Japan's air forces existed as a shadow of their former strength. Experienced pilots were dead or grounded by fuel shortages. New aircraft production had been disrupted by bombing and resource shortages. The fighters that continued to operate were often flown by partially trained pilots, young men given minimal instruction before being sent into combat against an enemy that dominated the sky through sheer numerical and technical superiority. But desperate circumstances created desperate tactics, and Japanese pilots in the final months of the war fought with a ferocity born of knowing they would likely not survive the war regardless of whether Japan surrendered or fought on. Perdomo made his decision in seconds. He had altitude advantage, a critical asset in aerial combat. Altitude could be converted into speed through diving, and speed was life in fighter combat, the resource that allowed you to engage or disengage at will, to dictate the terms of battle. He also had the element of surprise. The Japanese formation appeared unaware of his presence, focused on their mission, whatever it might be. Attacking alone against 15 aircraft violated every principle of tactical doctrine, which emphasized mutual support and coordinated attacks. But opportunities in war rarely arrived in perfect form. If Perdomo waited for backup, the enemy formation might disperse or reach friendly airspace. If he called for assistance, precious minutes would be lost while other aircraft vectored toward the target. The fighter pilot's instinct, honed by months of combat, told him to attack now, to exploit the momentary advantage before it evaporated. He pushed the Thunderbolt's nose down and dove toward the enemy formation. The acceleration was immediate and violent. The Thunderbolt, despite its mass, could dive like a falling anvil, gravity and engine power combining to drive the aircraft toward terminal velocity. The airspeed indicator needle swept past 200 miles per hour, past 300, past 400. The windscreen became a fixed tunnel of rushing air, and increasing G-forces pushed Perdomo into his seat. The distance to the enemy formation collapsed rapidly. 3,000 feet, 2,000, 1,000. Perdomo's hands remained steady on the controls, his feet light on the rudder pedals, his thumb hovering over the gun trigger on the control stick. 850 caliber machine guns waited in the wings, each barrel loaded with hundreds of rounds, each round a half-inch diameter projectile capable of punching through aluminum, steel, and flesh with equal indifference. The guns were harmonized to converge their fire at a specific point in space, several hundred feet ahead of the aircraft, creating a cone of destruction where all 8 streams of bullets intersected. A target caught in that convergence zone would be subjected to a storm of metal that few aircraft could survive. Perdomo selected his target with the cold calculation that separated survivors from casualties. He did not attack the lead aircraft, which would be flown by the most experienced pilot and would likely be the most alert. Instead, he focused on the trailing aircraft, stragglers whose pilots were either less skilled or flying damaged aircraft that could not maintain formation speed. These were the vulnerable targets, the ones most likely to fall to a single firing pass. The first target resolved in his gun sight, a Nakajima Ki-84 fighter known to Allied intelligence by the code name Frank. The Frank was one of Japan's best fighters, fast and maneuverable, armed with cannon and machine guns, flown by pilots who understood that every flight might be their last. But speed and maneuverability required awareness, and awareness required seeing the threat before it struck. Perdomo closed to firing range before the Frank pilot realized danger had arrived. The Thunderbolt's 8 machine guns opened fire simultaneously, their combined roar audible even over the engine noise. Tracers, every 5th round loaded with phosphorus to create a visible streak, arced toward the target in streams of light. The ballistic path of 50 caliber bullets was nearly flat at combat ranges, requiring minimal deflection shooting if the target maintained straight flight. Perdomo held the trigger down for 2 seconds, 3 seconds, long enough to deliver several hundred rounds into the target area. The Frank staggered in the air, pieces of its tail and fuselage tearing away under the impact of multiple bullets, each hit transferring tremendous kinetic energy into the aircraft's structure. One wing folded upward, its internal structure severed by the bullet strikes. The Frank rolled inverted and began to fall, trailing smoke and debris, its pilot either dead or incapacitated. The aircraft transformed from a flying machine into a tumbling mass of wreckage. Perdomo did not watch the Frank fall. He was already tracking his second target, another trailing aircraft. This one a Yokosuka K-5Y, codenamed Willow, a trainer aircraft being used for whatever limited combat role the Japanese could devise. The Willow was slow, lightly armed, and its pilot had no chance against the diving Thunderbolt. Perdomo fired again, a shorter burst this time, his ammunition supply now a factor requiring management. The Willow came apart under the gunfire, its fabric-covered control surfaces shredding, its engine trailing flame. It dropped away, falling toward the earth thousands of feet below. The element of surprise was gone. The remaining Japanese aircraft scattered, their pilots reacting to the attack with varying degrees of skill and panic. Some dove for the ground, hoping to find safety in low altitude where the Thunderbolt's speed advantage would be reduced. Others turned toward Perdomo, attempting to engage him in a turning fight where their lighter aircraft might have an advantage. But Perdomo had altitude and speed, the two resources that mattered most in aerial combat. He converted altitude into kinetic energy, diving after another target, a Frank that had broken right and was attempting to escape at low level. The pursuit took Perdomo down through 5,000 feet, 4,000, 3,000, the altimeter unwinding as the ground rose to meet him. The Frank pilot was skilled, jinxing left and right, making Perdomo's gun solution difficult. But the Thunderbolt's speed advantage was overwhelming. Perdomo closed the distance, lined up a deflection shot, and fired. The bullets caught the Frank in the engine and cockpit area. The aircraft snap-rolled left and dove vertically into the ground, exploding on impact in a brief flash of fire and smoke. 3 enemy aircraft destroyed. 3 kills in the span of minutes. Perdomo's gun camera was recording every second, mechanical proof of what was happening, evidence that would be reviewed by intelligence officers who would confirm or deny each victory based on the footage. But there was no time to consider the implications. Perdomo pulled up from his attack, climbing back toward altitude, his engine roaring at full power, fuel burning at an alarming rate. He scanned the sky, looking for more targets, and found them. Several more Japanese fighters, including Franks, climbing toward him. They had seen the destruction of their comrades and were maneuvering for revenge. Perdomo attacked again. The 4th kill came quickly, another Frank caught in a climbing turn, unable to evade the Thunderbolt's diving attack. Perdomo's burst was precise, concentrated, economical. The Frank's cockpit exploded under the impact of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds. The aircraft rolled onto its back and fell, trailing a thick column of black smoke. 4 victories, one more would make him an ace, would cross the threshold that separated ordinary fighter pilots from the elite. But the situation had become dangerous. Perdomo's altitude advantage was gone, expended in multiple diving attacks. His fuel state was now critical, the long flight from Okinawa and the high power settings during combat having consumed his reserve at an alarming rate. And his ammunition was nearly exhausted, the counters showing only a few hundred rounds remaining out of the 3,000 he had carried at takeoff. Then Perdomo saw his 5th target, another Frank separated from its formation, flying alone. He maneuvered into position, using the last of his altitude advantage to set up an attack run. His gun sight found the Frank, tracked it as the range decreased. Perdomo pressed the trigger. The guns fired in short bursts, then sputtered and stopped. He was out of ammunition. All 8 guns were empty, their barrels still hot from firing, their breech mechanisms locked open on empty chambers. The Frank, damaged but still flying, began to smoke and lose altitude, but it was not destroyed. It was not a confirmed kill. At that moment, 4 Japanese fighters appeared, diving toward Perdomo from his high rear quarter, the killing position. They had climbed above him while he focused on his attacks, had positioned themselves perfectly, and were now executing the same diving attack that Perdomo had used so effectively. But Perdomo had no ammunition. He could not fight. His only options were to run or to bluff. Running meant turning away, presenting his tail to the attackers, allowing them to close the distance and fire at leisure. The Thunderbolt was fast, but it was not fast enough to outrun fighters already in a dive, already close, already committed to the attack. Perdomo made a choice that defined his character in that instant. He turned into the attack, pointing the nose of his Thunderbolt directly at the leading Japanese fighter, as though he were preparing to fire, as though his guns were still loaded and ready. The range closed rapidly. Both aircraft hurtled toward each other at a combined closing speed of over 600 miles per hour. The Japanese pilot would see the Thunderbolt's nose, would see the dark openings of 8 gun barrels pointing directly at him, would have to decide in a fraction of a second whether to hold his fire and risk being shot down, or to break off and lose the killing opportunity. The Japanese pilot broke. He rolled away at the last moment, unwilling to risk head-on combat against what he believed was an armed enemy. The 3 fighters behind him followed, the formation scattering. Perdomo continued his turn, bringing the Thunderbolt around, maintaining the pretense of offensive capability even though he knew his guns were empty. The bluff had worked, but it could not be repeated. If the Japanese pilots regrouped and attacked again if they called his bluff, Perdomo would be defenseless. At that moment, another P-47 Thunderbolt appeared, diving into the fight. The pilot, a fellow member of the 57th Fighter Group, had heard the radio calls and come to assist. His guns were loaded. His presence changed the tactical situation instantly. The Japanese fighters, now facing 2 Thunderbolts, broke off and fled, diving toward the ground and disappearing into the landscape. The engagement was over. Perdomo circled back to the Frank he had damaged before running out of ammunition. The aircraft was spiraling downward, trailing thick smoke, clearly doomed. The other Thunderbolt pilot confirmed the kill over the radio, stating that he had witnessed the Frank go down. 5 victories. 5 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single mission. Oscar Perdomo had become an ace in the span of approximately 15 minutes of continuous combat. But the mission was not over. Perdomo's fuel situation had crossed from critical to desperate. The return flight to Okinawa would cover hundreds of miles of open ocean, and his remaining fuel supply might not be sufficient. The Thunderbolt's fuel gauges, never perfectly accurate, showed readings that suggested he might have enough to make it back, or might not. There was no alternative landing site, no friendly base in Korea, no place to divert if the engine quit from fuel starvation. Perdomo set course for Okinawa and settled into the disciplined routine of fuel management. Throttle back to minimum cruise power, adjust mixture settings for maximum economy, maintain optimal altitude and airspeed. The mathematics of consumption versus distance became an obsessive mental calculation, recalculated every few minutes as the fuel gauges dropped lower and the distance to Okinawa decreased. The Pacific spread below him, empty and indifferent, beautiful in its vastness, deadly in its scale. If the engine quit, he would have time to transmit a distress call, time to prepare for ditching, time to execute the emergency procedures practiced in training. But his chances of rescue would be minimal. The ocean was large, and a single pilot in a life raft was nearly impossible to find. The engine continued to run. The propeller continued to turn. The fuel gauges dropped toward empty, their needles hovering near the bottom of their ranges. Perdomo flew with total concentration, making minor adjustments to maintain optimal efficiency, watching the horizon for the first sight of Okinawa. The island appeared as a dark smudge on the horizon, grew larger, resolved into recognizable features. Perdomo called the tower, declared his fuel emergency, received immediate clearance for landing. He brought the Thunderbolt down in a straight approach, no circling, no delays. The wheels touched concrete. The aircraft rolled to a stop. The engine continued to run for a few more seconds, then coughed and quit, its fuel supply finally exhausted. Perdomo had made it back with nothing to spare. the final margin measured in seconds of engine operation. The debriefing was thorough and detailed. Intelligence officers listened to Perdomo's account, asked questions, took notes. The gun camera footage was removed from the aircraft and sent for development and analysis. Over the following days, the evidence was reviewed. The footage showed clearly the destruction of 5 enemy aircraft, all within minutes, all destroyed by Perdomo's fire or damaged so severely by Perdomo that their destruction was inevitable. The kills were confirmed. Oscar Perdomo was officially credited with 5 aerial victories achieved on August 13, 1945. He had become an ace in a single mission, a rare achievement in the history of aerial warfare. But there was another element that made his accomplishment unique. On August 14th, the day after Perdomo's mission, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese nation by radio, announcing Japan's acceptance of the terms of surrender. The war was over. Perdomo's victories on August 13th were among the last aerial combat victories of the Second World War. He was the last American pilot to achieve ace status in a single day. He was, in a very real sense, the last ace of the last great war. Perdomo returned to the United States after the war, continued his military service, and eventually retired after a career that spanned decades. He carried the memories of that August day with him, the 15 minutes when everything came together, when skill and opportunity and circumstance aligned to produce a result that would be remembered long after the men who lived it were gone. But he also carried other memories, heavier ones. His son Kenneth, the infant whose name had been painted on the Thunderbolt's nose, grew up and followed his father into military service. Kenneth Perdomo went to Vietnam, served as a soldier in that confused and brutal war, and was killed in action on September 3, 1968. Oscar Perdomo outlived his son, carried that grief for the rest of his life, understood in a way that few people ever have to understand that war takes from everyone, that its cost is paid not just by those who fight, but by those who love them, by children and spouses and parents who wait at home and receive telegrams that shatter their lives forever. The Thunderbolt named Lil May's meat chopper was eventually scrapped, broken down for parts or metal, its service completed, its purpose fulfilled. No physical trace of it remains except in photographs and records, but its story persists, passed down through the aviation history community, told and retold in books and documentaries and museum exhibits. The story persists because it represents something that transcends the specific details of one pilot and one mission. It represents the end of an era, the final moments of a type of warfare that would never exist again in quite the same form. Aerial combat after 1945 would become faster, more complex, more technological, more deadly. But it would never again have the same character as the daylight air battles of the Second World War, when men flew into the sky in machines they could see and touch and understand, when combat was visual and immediate, when victory or defeat was determined not by missiles launched from beyond visual range, but by positioning and gunnery and split-second decisions made in the terrifying intimacy of close combat. Oscar Perdomo's achievement on August 13, 1945, stands as a monument to courage, skill, and the peculiar grace that sometimes attends those who venture into mortal danger and emerge alive. But it also stands as a reminder of cost. Perdomo paid a price for his service, paid it in psychological stress and emotional trauma, paid it again decades later when his son was killed in a different war, paid it every day for the rest of his life. The men who become heroes in war, the men whose names are remembered and whose deeds are celebrated, are not separate from us, not fundamentally different, not immune to loss and grief, and the quiet devastation that comes from surviving when others do not. They are us, or we are them, and their stories are ours to remember and honor, not because they were superhuman, but because they were human, because they faced what they faced, and did what they did while carrying all the weight of ordinary human fear and love and hope and despair. The sky over Korea on August 13, 1945, saw many things. Aircraft destroyed, lives ended. A young pilot transformed into an ace, history compressed into minutes. But perhaps what it witnessed most fundamentally was the same thing that every battlefield witnesses. Human beings pushed to their absolute limits, making choices under pressure that will define them forever, doing what they believe must be done even when every instinct screams to turn away, to run, to refuse the burden. Oscar Perdomo flew into that sky carrying the name of his infant son painted on his aircraft, flew into combat knowing he might not return, destroyed 5 enemy aircraft in an engagement so intense and violent that its details blur into a sequence of actions and reactions almost too fast for consciousness to fully register. Then flew home across hundreds of miles of ocean with fuel tanks nearly empty, landed safely, and lived to old age carrying all that memory like a stone in his chest. His story is not just a story of victory. It is a story of survival and its aftermath, of what it means to do extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances, and then have to live with yourself afterward, to integrate the person who did those things with the person who remembers doing them, to reconcile the young man in the cockpit of a Thunderbolt with the old man looking back across decades. If you found this story meaningful, if the life and sacrifice of Oscar Perdomo moved you in any way, please consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like on this video. History consists of individual lives, individual moments, individual choices made by people whose names we often forget or never learn. Oscar Perdomo's name deserves to be remembered. His story deserves to be told. Before watching this video, had you heard of Oscar Perdomo, the last ace of the Second World War? Did you know that on the final day of active combat operations, while diplomats prepared surrender documents and world leaders contemplated peace, men were still flying into battle and dying in the sky? Share your thoughts in the comments below. History is not just what happened. It is also what we choose to remember, what we choose to honor, and what we choose to pass on to those who come after us.